one perspective on building a company is that any small failure is a really bad thing. You need to kind of internalize that, like, winning 51% of the time is the game.
From a machine learning perspective, how far along are we in, like, being able to be more specific in that guidance?
Taking care of a parent with dementia in a lot of ways is a slow process of kind of taking away privilege.
I'm super excited for this conversation for a variety of reasons that we'll get into, both like from a startup and venture ecosystem standpoint, but also from a personal standpoint we'll get to as well. But let's just start. Round of applause. Welcome, Nikhil of Craniometrics.
Thank you. Thank you.
Give us the TLDR. What is Craniometrix today?
Yeah.
And as a startup from a vision standpoint, don't go too deep. We'll get into it, but let's set some context.
Yeah, absolutely. So the high level is Craniometrix tries to help you take care of parents with Alzheimer's and dementia. So we try to help make it a little easier, try to keep mom out of the hospital a little more. And we do that at the moment primarily for family caregivers. So, a lot of support for you while you're taking care of mom at home. And we talk about, big picture vision. It's kind of to be the one-stop shop for Alzheimer's and dementia care. Kind of, be able to do everything someone needs as they go through that whole disease journey.
I want to get into kind of the why, but let's do that a little bit later. One of the first and most interesting things is when you first got signed up to do this, and I decided to look the startup up. I remember the landing page being different than what I expected in a way that I think is actually very much in the, let's get into the startup nerdery parts of this. So when you visit Craniometrix' website, to set some context for those who haven't yet and just came because of his LinkedIn profile or his wonderful lush hair. When you visit the website, it's a lot about a program called Guide. And then I looked that up and did some of my learning, but I want us to educate the audience a little bit, where I saw from your LinkedIn headline and a lot of what you post there was about dementia care and a platform, exactly what you said. But then today's version of it seems aligned with a Biden administration policy and kind of initiative. Let's get right into that, because that was, for me, even like, I had to context switch. What is Guide as it relates to Craniometrix and your mission? And we'll get into kind of the mechanics behind it, but give us a little bit of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we can talk more about it, but I think one of the things that's often difficult to do in healthcare when you want to invent something new or do something particularly novel is trying to figure out who pays for it, right? And what's the payment model? I mean, do consumers pay for it? Do insurance companies pay for it? Do doctors pay for it? And so there's a whole bunch of different things you can try. We've been working on dementia care for about 3 years now. And there was all of a sudden kind of this godsend about a year ago where, one of the Biden administration's policies and kind of, Medicare's policies from even before that was to obviously do something about dementia and Alzheimer's. I mean, it's becoming a bigger and bigger problem. We're spending, hundreds of billions of dollars on this every year. And so Medicare actually came out with a set of codes to pay for dementia care now. So you think about when you go to the doctor gives you a Band-Aid. Doctor's sending a code in, if you're above 65, to Medicare saying, hey, I gave Nikhil a Band-Aid. Here's what you have to pay me for it, and they pay for it. Medicare's kind of developed a program that now does the same thing for dementia care. So they've created this whole list of things. If you do these things, they'll pay you. So it's really cut and dry. I mean, it's almost like you go to the store and you can see a product listing for something, right? And a price associated with it. And this Guide program is new, about a year old now. And so we help doctors with it. We help doctors, meet the requirements of the program, participate, get this care to their patients in a cost-effective way and an efficient way. And in doing that, kind of been able to find a payment model that works really easily, because Medicare's kind of taken on the responsibility of making a decision of like, what does good dementia care look like? And so now our job shifts from, instead of trying to invent what good dementia care looks like, right, trying to follow, the path kind of Medicare's built.
So the reason I wanted to start there too, noticing as a founder, I want to get, founder to founder. So if some of my questions seem so blunt, forgive me, but I think the founders or the to-be founders in the room would appreciate it. When I saw that, I essentially thought, man, there was a moment in time where probably you were building, and we'll get into the what Craniometrix actually looks like from a product perspective, but you're building a set of products where you probably were looking for a wedge in, a go-to-market, and this comes along almost as a Trojan horse, and you have to adapt to it. How much, we'll learn in a second about, I want to actually ask about the product in a second here, but like in that moment, is your startup pre-Guide and post-Guide as different as it might seem to an outsider? Like, did you shift essentially from a policy perspective and say, hey, this means we should change our roadmap, we should change our product? or is it simply a go-to-market thing, and it's taking advantage again of federal program?
Yeah, primarily a go-to-market thing. I think if you do good work and you sit down, you take a couple months and you really want to figure out what does a patient with Alzheimer's, what does a patient with dementia need, right? How do you help them? Anyone that spends a really concentrated period of time talking to a lot of these folks will come to the same conclusion, right? Whether that's our 10-man startup or that's Medicare, right? You'll come to the same conclusion about what you need to, what this person needs. And so product is very similar as to what it was before. I think that the go-to-market shifted, obviously, and product shifted in some small directions, but the important side of product, which is what are we actually doing for patients and their families, is exactly the same.
Which essentially means, I think that's the interesting thing from a founder perspective. A lot of what you're building in aligning with this program, you're hoping is the zeitgeist in this industry, or you already knew was the zeitgeist of hey, these patients, exactly what you said, we know what they need. The startup's mission is not to reinvent the wheel entirely, but instead to say, the delivery method is ineffective or the stakeholders aren't capable of actually adopting it. And I'll share, I have a parent going through this, over the past year. So our family's, kind of experiencing it. So when I read all of this, it made total sense because it's kind of no, what needs to happen is pretty darn clear. Yeah. Getting it done is one of the most impossible tasks on the planet. So that makes total sense. Let's take way step back and talk about the founding journey. Why Craniometrix?
Yeah, absolutely. So my senior spring, so it would have been January of 2021, kind of coming into that. My grandpa was diagnosed with dementia. This time on my mom's side, and not that anything I would have built in the 4 or 5 years in between, stopping dementia and Alzheimer's work and 2021 would have changed the world for him, have been super impactful. But you have one of those kind of look in the mirror moments, right, on where am I spending my time and what am I doing and what am I actually building for kind of the world around me. And again, for my family, it's up. My mom is knock on wood in great health now, but clearly has a genetic proclivity for these conditions, those type of things. And so thought was, how do you build in Alzheimer's again? And so circled back post-grad, late 2021 to start Craniometrix and think about how do we build better support tools in dementia and Alzheimer's. And, like I said, if you sit down and you really figure out what the patients need and what the families need, you'll come to the same conclusion about what you need to build product-wise. And we'll talk about this more later, but that's actually one of the things that kind of has given us a really big head start around this guide program is we actually built a lot of the stuff beforehand. But the go-to-market was different, right? And so we're building consumer tools. We're building kind of what we call in healthcare kind of value-based programs and, contracting folks on that side. And, now still do both of those things, but spend a lot of time on guide as well.
When you decide to start addressing, kind of dementia and Alzheimer's, did you know what the product would look like today, or did you go back to let me create games again, brain games? Yep. Let me create something that the patient can literally. And I know you're saying it was at first not through providers, but how much of that early thing was a year of testing a variety of stuff versus you having a pretty clear idea from day 0 and 1?
Yeah. It's a good question. I think which of the first year was a lot of testing different stuff and seeing what worked, seeing what didn't. I think, we did at first go back to that concept of kind of brain games, these kind of interactive ways to,
Why didn't that work?
Yeah, I mean, so, interestingly, it worked. And what we were building, worked. I think that we moved away from it primarily because I think there's an important consideration when you're building in kind of any space, but particularly in healthcare, of are you building, a business or are you building kind of a science research organization, right? When I was doing this back as a kid, we were doing science research, and you can think about building in a very different way when you're doing that. When it comes to building a business, I think what was interesting was we were seeing actually really good results out of our early screening tools and, really high accuracy, better than what was on market. Today, we were, people were using them and consumers were paying to use these things. And, but then I think when you think long term, right, obviously, one of the most important considerations when building a business is what's the longevity of this business. And I think something that was interesting that was happening at the time when we were thinking about these game things was we didn't at the time have blood tests for Alzheimer's. We do now, and so a year ago, the blood test cost $2,000. Now they cost $200. And so, the problem when you're kind of just trying to invent something new is I think that there's this existential risk of, someone else build something that fundamentally works differently and fundamentally is better. I mean, in the US, we'll always pay for a blood test over a digital diagnostic, right? And so it's not, and the skill set that we had building.
So the games were really about diagnostic.
Yeah, quantifying the disease state, progression, those types of things.
Is compliance also something that you maybe felt that old concept was too much, like getting either the person's family member to get them to realize, first of all, I should get a diagnosis at all, and then also get the person to do it? Was that also an issue?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think it's interesting. A lot of people, then this is changing because you might have seen there's some new Alzheimer's drugs that have come out and that type of stuff, and that's all really promising and exciting. But still now, and particularly 2 years ago, you'd ask a random sample of 65-year-olds, hey, do you want to take a test? You want to know if you have dementia, Alzheimer's coming? A lot of people would say no. I mean, a lot of people just didn't want to know because they felt like there wasn't a lot you could do. So it's kind of like, what's the point of knowing if I'm not going to do anything with information and just going to be scared and stressed and those type of things. And so absolutely there was. And it was interesting. The way in, the place you usually got people to actually engage to take these tests was people's kids asking that. It's like, hey, say, take this test. I kind of want to know. You figure out some of these things, see what we can do to help. So that was an in. But from a personal perspective, I think a lot of people didn't actually want to take these unless they had some exposure to the disease already, right? So if they had a parent who had the condition, those type of things, right? Like they're like, hey, maybe I should take this, figure it out. But I mean, there was an education question there as well that I think would have come up later for us. I think the population that wanted to screen themselves early was large enough, to start a business and to build a business at first. But it's definitely not everyone that should be screened. Just
real briefly, I'm curious, how many people in the crowd are experiencing kind of close dementia in a family member? Because it's interesting, your whole point about who in that family nucleus or friend nucleus, whatever it might be, provider nucleus, decides to start this journey. Feels like if I were you as a founder, I'd imagine that's like half the battle in those early years to figure out. So then you decide in some moment in this journey that, okay, the games and the diagnostic isn't working. Let's go to that moment. But first, let me ask, is that before or after YC?
That was during YC.
During YC.
One of those classic, kind of during YC.
So then let's talk about YC for a second first before we get there. So what made you decide YC was the journey? Obviously, you're a young founder, if you don't mind me saying. It shows in the difference we have on our hair. But that's a choice, I think, especially that would have been 21 or 22.
2022.
At that point, funnily enough, I think YC is making a little bit of a comeback, but at that point in the market in tech, fundraising was a little bit easier for pre-seed and seed companies. Accelerators were getting a little bit of do founders have to do an accelerator nowadays? You can just go raise some money. Now I think, again, the idea of an accelerator or a YC type program is back in vogue, considering, the early markets changed and expectations on startups have changed again. So school is back in session. But what was the decision for you as a founder to decide to do YC?
You go back to 2020, 2021 when things were super hot. I think, a bunch of people were of that mind. Why do YC? I mean, we got a little bit of the froth, but I think less than we would have liked. Everyone would have wanted more. But I think it was primarily driven by, one of my kind of focuses early on was that, we got capital offers before YC. But it was that, I think building successful business requires a lot more than cash. And I think it's easy to it's easy to not think that way and think, capital kind of comes in and solves all your problems. But I think there's a lot more that you need. And to your point, this was my first job out of school, and figured it couldn't hurt to do a little bit of learning. I also think from the first time you're building a company perspective, the thing you should be optimizing for is how likely are you to win on, as a binary, right? Like as a 0 to 1, and not how much money are you going to make if you do win, right? And I think early stage founders do that calculus wrong a lot.
Not only on this is such an important point, not only the notion of money, like they're like, oh, how much equity should I keep and around it, but even small decisions about market or how early should I reveal my idea? How early should I go to market? Like all these things. I love that point. Your first time, even if it winds up being that you're Zuckerberg and your first time is your best time, you still should be first playing binary to win by default.
Yeah.
Was that the best thing about it? Like the thinking while you're in the program, basically they're just hyper-focusing you on make something work?
Yeah, totally. And I think there's, healthcare and healthcare tech as a industry, I think, has gotten a lot more sophisticated over the past few years. But I think there's still a pretty marked difference between how people build healthcare companies and how people think about building in healthcare companies and the timelines and those type of things versus kind of classic B2B SaaS and what YC does. And there are a lot of good reasons for that. I mean, certain things in healthcare move slower and they have to move slower. But I think a lot of the way people think about healthcare and the problems of building a technology company in healthcare are in some ways self-imposed, right? And so I think that the structure and the attitude with which, YC or people kind of building those type of companies generally take to building is a helpful thing to realize. Yeah. Absolutely.
If you could change one thing about YC as a YC founder, what's something you'd want?
Well, for me, the answer is easy. I don't think this is universal for everybody, but for us, YC was remote. This was coming out of COVID, and I was in San Francisco for what a lot of us were, and you got some of the social stuff, but COVID was still around, particularly for international founders and stuff that weren't able to come to the States, and so formally YC was remote. You didn't get to spend time with your partners, those type of things in person, so that would have been nice.
Another vote for the in-person cultural shift to come back. I love it. Okay, so you're in YC, and again, we have this moment where you realize, hey, that approach of maybe diagnostics or games that are more direct isn't the pathway. We already know that the pathway is going to involve something that is a little bit more about the care and the standard of care around the patient. Take us to that moment. What does it look like?
So interestingly, it was it's probably a few weeks before demo day that we're getting good traction on the on commercialization from the perspective of the early screening games and tools and stuff, and we had some partnerships with physicians, and we had people buying the tools. We had all this stuff. We had really good momentum there. And it's interesting. It's interesting calculus because you take a step back and you're actually like, we were getting offers in for capital and those type of things kind of pre-demo day with what we were kind of putting up from a screening perspective and a game perspective. And then, we talked to one of our group partners and we were kind of like, hey, what do you do when something's working, but something else might work better, right? I mean, I think that's it's a great, it's a great choice to have.
How did you know about this other thing, by the way, in that moment? What was the test or the data that told you, this is good, but this might be better?
Yeah. I think it was primarily you would give someone, one of these screening tools, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, but the people that would take screens primarily it was two groups. It's one either because their kid told them to, or B, and the larger group for us at first was actually someone taking it because they had a parent with the disease and now they want to screen themselves, right, and see where they're at. And usually the people who were taking it currently had this parent they were taking care of, right? So they're taking care of mom at home and they're taking our test to see what their likelihood was, right? And they take this stuff and then they'd ask us for 50 other things, and it's obviously the best way to figure out what to build ever. But they'd be there's no great across the spectrum of anything to do with Alzheimer's and dementia. There's no good user experience for stuff, and we were starting to build one that people liked, and so people were taking these tests and saying, hey, this is great. Can you do X, Y, Z other things? Like, can we use this for mom for measuring her agitation or like these other symptoms that are going on?
Progression of the disease over time.
Exactly. Yeah. All sorts of different things. And the answer at first was no, we can't. But we started getting more and more of that in. And
pulling it out of you.
Yeah.
That's the best signal as a startup founder.
Absolutely.
When your roadmap is almost like being begged for.
Yeah, totally. And we spent more time studying that space and what that looked like. Building an early stage company, I would say, is two things. One is it's an incentive alignment game, and then the second is it's a resource allocation game, right? And while you could spend time, we could have kept doing the early screening stuff and kind of gone down that hole in the research, collected more data, continue to do all that stuff, and started to build some of these care tools. You couldn't do both of them, as fast. And so it's kind of a decision on well, how big do we think this can get in either space? And, and then
so you're in the room with that YC partner, basically posing this. What was the feedback?
Yeah. Well, she actually had a story. Her husband had a large kind of successful company, a couple of them that he built, one of which they, I can't remember the exact number, but one of which was, I think, a $10 million business that doing X thing that they shifted, they decided to cut and run and do something different, even though that, X business was growing really well because they thought something else might work better. So she had seen it. I think a lot of the partners have seen things kind of like this, and have had to make these type of calls. I think anyone that ends up, running a fairly large business at a point is at least making a call then, right, between different divisions and stuff. And so the advice was to, take the jump in and go for it, right? Like the game is to build, it's how do you build a company that can help as many people as possible? And from one perspective, also then become as large as possible. And so, if you think there's another way forward there, it kind of doesn't matter that you spent, 6 months, 8 months building what you've been building, right?
Right.
So yeah.
Sunk cost fallacy.
Yeah.
The opportunity for you ahead was much greater. So, what does it look like in those early days? So, again, you're going to come to a place where this is a lot about, I think, the product is about surrounding care.
Yeah.
Is that literally what the choice was in that moment, or is it something transitionary before it looks like what it does today?
Yeah, it was pretty much straight to that. I mean, I think we toyed around a little bit with like, what does wraparound care for dementia mean? And that the
so tell us, by the way, what does that? Let's get a little bit producty.
Yeah.
What does it mean?
Absolutely. So right now, and I think this is actually where we kind of toyed around with some different things. But right now, it's kind of evolved into wanting to be the first place someone goes when they need help with anything that's going on, right? The reality of it is like we're not going to solve, we spend $350 billion in Alzheimer's every year. Our market is not $350 billion, right? Because you're not going to solve going to the neurologist when X thing happens, right? Or actual hospitalizations, like these type of things. But what we want to do is be kind of that first line of defense around stuff, right? So we want, we want to know what's happening on a daily basis, right? So what symptoms are showing up? How's mom reacting to X, Y, Z thing? Is she eating? Is she taking her medications? And then we spend most of our time building kind of machine learning tools to take all that information and figure out what to do with it, right? So if XYZ thing is happening, mom's this is what's happening for mom. How do you address this problem, right? And how do you solve this problem? Hopefully preemptively. I mean, you've probably seen this. Unfortunately, dementia care today is very reactive, and for good reason. In that taking care of a parent with dementia in a lot of ways is a slow process of kind of taking away privilege, right? Like mom has to move in with you, and you have to take away her keys, and you have to do all these things, one by one. And no one wants to do those things. And so you don't take away mom's keys until she crashes the car, right? You're not make her move in with you until she leaves the oven on all night. And
by the way, the workers inside the space, which you probably know this very well, always try to warn you about exactly the pattern that you talked about. And they're like, this is what's going to happen next. We know it.
Yeah.
And it's up to you to make the time delayed decision. So to your point, like getting all the data, but how reliable is it? Because I think you're going to get to a portion where you decide, family and providers being an essential platform, correct me if I'm wrong, begins to be the right solution here so that everyone can be inputting data. Then you get data for machine learning stuff, but you also are basically SaaSifying the experience so that, again, provider and family can be more integrated. Is that mostly accurate?
Yeah. So that's what we do now.
I want to touch on the UX of that. From a machine learning perspective, how far along are we in being able to be more specific in that guidance? I mean, you just like that provider can tell me, do this earlier, this is what's going to happen next. Do you tell me that with a lot of confidence? Is it similar to what it is now with, let's say, a social worker that's going to say, here's where it's going to go next? Or where are we in that journey of being able to actually map someone's experience with either a combination of data or best practice?
Yeah, it's.
I guess that goes to the guide program, by the way.
Yeah. And I think as an industry, we're trying to just get better at this and figure out more of these pathways and stuff. We can do it a lot better than a social worker can. In this, there are a lot of things social workers are better. I mean, the thing that social workers are really good for, and the thing that we try to optimize their time for is that emotional connection stuff, right? I mean, it's you getting to talk to someone about, hey, here's what's going on, and getting to have that kind of emotional connection that makes you feel a little better, and venting and stress relieving and those things. And so what we try to do when we work with social workers or social workers on the platform is say, how do we make them as efficient at the rest of their jobs, right? So that they have more time for that stuff. But part of that rest of their job stuff is figuring out, where is the disease going and what timeline is mom on. And the reality of it, right, is that there's no party, and this is one of the problems right now, is there's not really any party that has full visibility into how mom's doing or how someone's Alzheimer's journey is going. Because, you have things you're seeing in the home that, you're seeing on a daily basis, right? Maybe you're making some notes. Best case, you're probably, summarizing for the doctor once every 3 months, kind of what's happening for 2 minutes, right? The doctor is seeing a couple different things. You have, by the way, also you have a primary care doctor, a neurologist, you have a couple different docs involved. The social worker seeing some things, the respite agency seeing something. You have all these different people that are seeing different things. And so you can benefit a lot from this perspective, how accurate can we get about what's going to happen when you just bring all of that together, right? And you have a really clean set of detailed data.
From a product perspective, to get into the weeds of it, how do you decide who owns, I assume because now you're in this guide journey that the provider is going to be the one who's your primary stakeholder and user. Was that obvious at first? Because I can imagine someone has to own the core patient profile, right? The record of the patient and where that data lives and who's primarily responsible for updating it and looking at it. What patient versus provider, was that hard? Was that easy as a choice?
Yeah, I wouldn't even say we've fully made it a choice in terms of saying, it's entirely one or the other. I think the end of the day, if you have to choose, it's going to be the provider, right? Because the provider, at this point, the providers are our customers, and providers are the ones that hold, really kind of the ground truth on the clinical side of what's going on, right? And so they have, from, in one sense, the most important information. But we think a lot of, when you think about how do you help someone with the condition, or how do you help someone taking care of someone with the condition, a lot of that is not based on the clinical side of like where the disease is, right? Because like big clinical decisions need to be made once a quarter, once every 6 months, once a year. But it's the day-to-day stuff that's hard, right? I mean, like how do I deal with mom like falling, or like her home safety issues, right? Or her getting agitated and not eating dinner and like yelling at me. Like those type of things are the things you need to solve for. And there are ways to solve for them, but the person that's, the data that you need to solve for that stuff is not something the provider really has. It's data that you need inputted from the caregiver in home, right? And so and that's that data on like what is mom eating, what's her how's she adhering to her medication schedule, when are you seeing these symptoms, and we're trying to correlate like based on when you're seeing these symptoms, you have to make a diet change, right, or like a meal timing change, or things like that, right, or do you need aromatherapy, like that type of stuff. So it's the provider. To answer your question directly, it's probably the provider if you have to choose one, but the most of the data is coming from the caregiver.
Well, so the guide program comes into play, puts the provider even more into the focus here because you're helping them be compliant with, again, my understanding and from what you were mentioning earlier, all of the stuff that isn't the kind of emotional care. It's kind of like the logistics of following the guide best practices. What does that look like as a founder from a like compliance, regulatory, and payment standpoint? Because the advantages sound fantastic in terms of there's this federal program, it's accelerating all of dementia care in kind of a unified direction, saying here are the principles that unlock, kind of subsidy and access to care from a federal perspective. But compliance and, kind of, I assume, regulatory hurdles and things like that are the complicated part. How complicated is that?
Very. I think that the short answer, it's, one from a product perspective, like, healthcare IT regulations get a lot more intense when you're working with providers, and also, particularly when you're dealing with clinical medicine, right? I mean, I think what we're doing before working with providers in this context was kind of, non-clinical care management and, doing that for patients that are caregivers. So there was a lot to be careful around data safety, those type of things, but significantly more now. So from a product perspective, there's a lot there, and we spend, quite a chunk of engineering time on all of that.
Is there anything off the shelf on that stuff, like privacy, HIPAA compliance, stuff like that, or is it basically like every 0 to 1 of a health tech startup that decides they're either going to be clinical in line with regulatory, or kind of to what eventually happens with payment, with insurance and other things where you're going to have to be really kind of diligent? Is that all 0 to 1 engineering work?
Yeah, I mean, they're off the shelf solutions if I think a lot of startups kind of make this call between in healthcare makes this call. Yeah, right. And I think that's influenced primarily by this idea of like, are you as a startup, like, do you want to be a clinical medicine startup and you want to essentially be some, a fancy digital doctor's office, or do you want to be, are you some type of like non-clinical like tooling thing, right? And the area where it gets complicated, and in either of those cases, there's really good kind of like buy solutions. So if you're, there's all sorts of great startup like electronic health record stuff now, like billing stuff and stuff. If you're doing the clinical stuff, the place where for us it gets a little more confusing is that we're in the middle of these two things, right? And so we're kind of, we're helping doctors fulfill the requirements of this program, and like they need to bill for this, they need to, they're providing clinical work, so they need to stay in compliance on all of those fronts. But the place where we've been able to be effective in the place where we've won customers is because we've been able to build a lot of tooling that makes their whole care process a lot more efficient. And all of that tooling, right, has to be custom, and so you have to bear the weight of some of the regulatory stuff yourself.
How do you validate as the founder in that moment that you're there? Is there kind of like people you can check in with on the provider side, on the regulatory side to go, we did it? Or are you, much like founders often are, in a state of gray area where you're like, I think we're all in compliance because we're looking at other people, looking at the paper and going, we think we're doing everything right, so let's do it until someone tells us no.
No, I think that in healthcare, we talk about this to an extent with wanting to take the YC mentality and apply it to healthcare. And I think that's great. I think the other important consideration, though, is that healthcare is one of those few places where you build fast, great, break things not so great, right? And so there is an important consideration to internally make sure you're doing the right thing before and not be in that gray area. Because I think our perspective on it, at least, is that if you're in that gray area, you don't have a product that you can sell with confidence, right? And so it takes there's a little more upfront effort to figure out some of those things. And
are you still got kind of in the wilderness, or are there places in? I guess it depends on where in healthcare you are, but like for you, can you go check in with either like a board or some sort of regulatory body to go like, are we doing this the right way? Or is it mostly like talking to providers and feeling like you're just like every other vendor checking off on lists, but it's mostly self-directed?
Yeah. It's a combo. A lot of it is self-directed. There's not like a one-stop shop, like evaluation
stamp
group. Right, that you can get.
Which I assume you would want as a founder.
Which would be great.
Could.
Which would be great. But one of those doesn't exist. For us, it's really about working with the providers, and particularly when you go work with larger health systems, these type.
They'll tell you, right?
Yeah. There's sophisticated groups that are gonna dive into the code base, do all of the checking and stuff they want themselves, make sure their providers are doing the right thing, and I think that's where we can derive most of our confidence from.
Let's get abstract for a second. You've been building this for a couple of years now. If you could go back and do one thing differently throughout the past few years as a founder, what would you do differently?
There are a lot. Actually, a good example is we made this big call, right, going away from the screening stuff that was working towards now this kind of caregiver focus, care management, like whole person care idea. That was a big jump from this perspective. Like how do you really make sure you're focusing in exactly on where the biggest opportunity is, and not kind of running with something that is working, right? And I think there are a lot of small decisions like that on like a day-to-day basis that I try to continue to get better at, right? But that we could have been better at historically, and like we'll continue to
Is there a behavior change on your side that you like go back and go, I wish I had this framework, or I wish during those decisions I took more time, or I wrote things down? Like what would it look like for you to take it differently?
I think there is a framework that I try to apply now, and I think it's just it's more focused and thoughtful kind of experimentation, right? I think it's one perspective on building a company is that any failure, right? Any small failure is a really bad thing, right? And like this sucks. Like this is your thing you're trying to build, and you're trying to build this great thing, and I think people are founders are in some ways really, really risk loving and take the jump to like do these type of things. But like then once you're building a company, I think are really risk averse from this perspective of like not wanting to really get something wrong. And so I think you need to be really good at doing that, right? And like need to kind of internalize that like winning 51% of the time is the game, right? And
it's all probabilistic.
Yeah, exactly. And so just running enough experiments, like you can really get to that, right? And like really thinking about what does an experiment mean, right? Like what is success or failure on this axis mean? And really cleanly scoping out, what that looks like. And that might be, you're bringing on advisors to help with sales or those type of things, right? Like what does success and failure look like here for each of these people? And being really clean, and particularly with people, it's tough to say, like, like when is something going well and when is something going poorly, right? But getting really good at setting fixed milestones, and when you don't meet those milestones, kind of moving on to test something new.
You've raised about $6 million bucks. What's interesting about fundraising, either to your industry or maybe as a young founder, or what's like a lesson you'd impart to folks on the fundraising process, having successfully done a seed round?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've raised a little over 6 publicly, and the I think the interesting thing when it comes to raising. It's truly there isn't like a one size fits all story. I mean, I think we raised a really strong round, probably the strongest round, if not one of the couple strongest healthcare rounds out of YC, our batch, and probably on average for most of the batches, and that was interesting because we had just made, we made this move and shift and stuff. And I think the thing that was interesting was actually that exposing your investors to things that you're scared about or that you're concerned about
is changing.
Is great. Yeah.
You brought them in, I assume, because it was so close to that journey.
Yeah.
To like why you made those choices.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, we even had, and we had some offers that we had come in. We had one of them wired or something, but that they came in before we made this move, right? And I had this really interesting moment where, we raised on safes. Fortunately, I do the whole thing on, that whole round on safes. And it was great because, you don't have a boss, you can kind of, do what you want. And so, but I had this moment where I was like, well, hey, look, we just, we got some of these offers, you just took this money. I mean, can we still take this money now if we want to do, something that's kind of the same.
Same problem, different solution.
Right, same problem, different solution, right? And it was my first time doing this. I was, 21, maybe 22 at the time. And I was like, well, I was scared. I was like, are these people gonna get mad at me? Like, what's gonna happen? And so, I worked with the coach and I called, a couple guys that had given us terms and the guy that wired, and I was like, hey, look, like, we're doing this instead. This is why we're doing it. And then I was like, do you want your money back? Every time I did this, as soon as I said that, they paused and then laughed. And they were like, this is crazy because one, everyone expects this. This is what happened. And this is in the grand scheme of like how startups pivot, we made a pretty small one actually.
Right. Yeah. And Slack was a games company before it was Slack.
Right. We made a pretty small one. And then two, no one ever does, they never receive calls like that because no one does it. And that was actually real gay because I think it was confidence inspiring in our investors and investors we did that with.
Gave you permission to run those experiments.
Yeah, exactly. We did a similar thing with new investors we were talking to and stuff. So I think fundraising, I think showing vulnerabilities in a way obviously that's honest, but in a way that's reflective of what's actually going on.
You want people who are in it for your approach too.
Totally.
I think that's like the thing I share with founders all the time when they ask me like how to think about picking an investor or raising a round. If they're going to be counter to your trend or only wanting you to take certain types of bets, you mentioned like not having a boss, even if you have the boss, whatever it is, you want that to be still, hey, we're rowing in the same direction.
Totally.
And that's a broad set of experiments, not this narrow solution,
Absolutely.
Which is good for everybody. Last thing for me, what's the next challenge that you're, as a founder in a team, attempting to solve?
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, we've gotten to the point where we have product that works. We have people that pay for product and have count on it as our customers. Some of the largest neurology practices, those types of things in the country. And so now I think it's a matter of how do we think about continuing to scale what's worked really efficiently, right? And the interesting thing is that there's theoretically no caps, like how fast you can go or how quickly you can build and how quickly you can grow a customer base. But so how do you do that in a way that's efficient, just efficient and effective growth, right? Is kind of where we're at now. Thinking from that perspective too of like we've started from a product perspective now, we built all the product that we need to be a part of this program and to meet all these requirements and do all this stuff. And so now, product making has shifted as well to this efficiency point, right? So both from like the business overall and from product, it's just like how do we make marginal improvements from a process perspective, get more efficient and grow the business, which is different than it's different going into a call with the doctor, right? Knowing that other doctors, bigger practices, bigger health systems have bought this stuff and that the stuff works and that it should work for them too, than it was when no one had bought it, right? And you're like, is this even interesting at all? And it gives you a little more agency. I think the cool thing about it is it gives you a little more agency to make decisions yourself, right? At the end of the day, you always want to be listening to customers and doing this thing, right? But really early on, from a product perspective, that's all you're doing, right? And like someone's, you're going to do whatever it takes to win that first customer, and that's great, and that's probably what you should do. The reality of it is, customer ideas aren't always good, right? And
most of the time they are. Well, I tell founders all the time, in the early days, they're all subject matter experts. You're trying to learn what to build from them. You don't want to listen too closely to, someone else actually said this really well. It's like, listen to their problems, try to ignore their solutions, but they're the subject matter expert. And eventually that relationship shifts. And you get all the requests and the questions and you become the subject matter expert. You have the confidence, the data. And that moment is important to recognize because also then it gives you advantages as to what you can decide as an industry.
Yeah.
How should this tool look? What should the practitioners do? What's the next step evolution of this, even from a healthcare perspective? But also it gives you the ability to, I think, come from data in a lot of those conversations and say, hey, we actually know something that the rest of the industry might not, and we can start to fuel even, hopefully this happens for you guys in healthcare and happens for me all the time. A newcomer in the industry goes, I'm starting a startup. Can I pick your brain? It's like, oh, now I have something to give you. Before I had questions and we could brainstorm and I'm your friend founder. Now I'm somebody who can give you a peek behind certain corners too. It's really interesting. Awesome. Let's go to crowd for questions. Go ahead.
I can ask a question. You're in your growth path right now. I'm curious, as a founder, you're probably dedicating 20, maybe 30% or a little bit more to product development. From a business process engineering standpoint, do you separate the business from the product so that you can grow faster?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'd say no at the moment. Though it's possibly something I should do more of and think more critically about. I think we're still we're not a Series B company that's growing then, so it's like we're still at the point where these things are somewhat intermingled, right? And like there is a lot of relation, and as Rich said, you don't now build every feature a customer requests to try to make a sale. There's still some customers you do that for, right? So there's still the really big fish that are I want X thing. We're building doing a sprint on some stuff now to get ready for a demo on next week with one of these guys, and so it's still mixed. That's it.
Do you have teams do you have people of this team today that are dedicated only to the business and customer facing side of things, or is everyone kind of in that intermingled zone?
Yeah, most people are in the intermingled zone, but we have a couple folks now that are purely on the on the customer side and purely on kind of the sales and partnership side, which is helpful now because now it's kind of like you can give these guys kind of a hard line really on like here's what we can do, here's what we can't do, and then you get you get even better directional information on how well does the product resonate across the entire market, right? Because like you need to have a hard line in order to figure that out. If you don't have a hard line and you're always like, we'll build whatever, right? Then like whatever you build, it'll always kind of fit, right? So so that's been helpful too from seeing what works, what doesn't.
Let's do one more question. Okay.
Have you considered expanding into other verticals aside from dementia?
Yeah. It's a super good question. We get this question a lot. Investors ask this question the most. I don't know if you do some VC stuff, but it's a common VC question. It's like, it's like, what do you do after, right? And how does this grow? I think my answer to it is not super crystal clear in that there are a couple different options. But one perspective, my main perspective is that like, if we can do what we want to do successfully in dementia, you'd really have no reason to build a business anywhere else. If you do this successfully in dementia and Alzheimer's, we do this kind of so there's 7-8 different types of common dementias. We do it for all of these, and it's kind of one stop for all of it. But if you build the business well here, that's a $20-30 billion business. I think so you can win really big here. And there's value to specificity, right? Both from the perspective of like product is a little bit different, but also from a brand connection perspective, right? I mean, people like things that feel bespoke to them, particularly when a condition is as difficult as dementia and Alzheimer's is, right? And that's where people always saw. I think it's one of the partners at Sequoia gave a talk where he's saying, well, hey, why does everyone invest? If we really buy into this thesis of like AGI is coming, right? Like, why are we investing in, all of these other startups? Like, AGI will solve all these problems. But the reality of it is I think the one thing you can't replace is that brand connection value, right? And like, I think the more that if we do get AGI, we get better things there. The thing that's going to be really valuable that you can't replace is that specificity and is that feeling of connection to brands that you're working with. So I think we stay in dementia because of that. I think there's opportunity elsewhere, and the model definitely works for some other disease states. But we plan to stay.
Listen, this has been a great conversation, Nikhil. Round of applause for you for sharing all these insights.
Thank you.